Hello, everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we take a look at great theories of everything, ancient and modern, do deep dives to help you figure out how to use these things in your life to their greatest capacity. Mostly people who spent their whole life working on something and got very little credit, very little remuneration, and but made great strides putting together some crackpot project of theirs, and we're trying to make sure that they don't fall upon the scrap heap of history. Today is our 89th reading from the book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha by Daniel Ingram. And generally, Dr. Ingram tries to do just what the book's title says, give you the core teachings that the Buddha, so-called, if you believe in him. Otherwise, this 2,500-year tradition of Buddhism provided maps and techniques for enlightening ourselves, for conferring wisdom upon ourselves. And he tries to mine that and translate it into modern English. And he paid his dues. He went down a lot of blind alleys. He spent thousands of hours on the cushion meditating. And he spent many, also thousands of hours reading books and consulting with enlightened masters, so-called, from various traditions. And puts it all into one package for us on a silver platter. Now, yesterday's reading was not so much like that. It was an exploration into very much obscure territory that probably has no, certainly not any of the core teachings of the Buddha. That was, fractal study of the jhanas and sub-jhanas and sub-sub-jhanas, and I could have done without that, but that's pretty much been the only major objection I have, other than the fact that it's very interesting to note that Ingram contends that he is enlightened, yet he is still not red-pilled. And so that, well, at least as of 2017, maybe he is now. I'm wondering what his relationship is to the bioweapon that you probably know what I'm talking about, as a physician. Okay, we're going to move into this section that's called luminosity. And we're getting out of this section where he's going into the fractals of jhanas and stuff. Backing up a bit, during the second half of 1996 and through the summer of 1997, I was still working only about 25 hours a week. So I had a lot of time to practice, and that is what I did for about 3 to 4 or more hours per day when I could, and at least 2 each day, with meticulous mindfulness during daily life when I could get it. My lunch break was dedicated to practicing vipassana while doing walking meditation and the Brahma Viharas of loving kindness, compassion, appreciation, and equanimity. I also started buying and reading as many Dharma books as possible and reading everything I could about the maps and meditation. Kenneth and I weren't talking much about Dharma, and the internet was nothing like it is today. So books were what I turned to. As there were no meditation teachers in Chapel Hill, which is where I was at that time, although I had only started meditating a few years before that, and certainly wasn't at the level that he was at. As there were no meditation teachers in Chapel Hill who seemed to know anything about what I was looking for and experiencing, I started going on retreats at the Bhavana Society in West Virginia with Bhante Gunaratana, whom I also consider an arhat. The drive there from Chapel Hill was not too long, and I am not sure exactly how many retreats I went on during the period of late 1996 to 2002, but adding up all the 4 to 7 day retreats and the 17-day retreat over winter break in 2001, I'm guessing I went on about 3 months of retreat there in total. Basically, if I had a break of some sort, I was there for a retreat. I went on my first retreat at the Bhavana Society in October 1996 for about a week and crossed the arising and passing of my third big insight cycle. The dark night wasn't that significant or memorable and caused little disruption. Why some dark nights at various phases of practice cause varying degrees of difficulty is still a mystery that hopefully will be resolved someday. The general theory that I learned from Bill is that at various levels, you might have more stuff related to that layer of mind. And if you had more stuff, then you were likely to stay at that level longer and have a harder time. Which also makes sense to me. I think it's interesting that Ingram has not made any type of distinction between past life karma and current life karma. And perhaps, what he does say is that it's better to go after insight meditation than working on your stuff through like shamatha meditation to attain wisdom and then work on your stuff, because you're always going to have stuff. But if you can deal with your past life karma, and then the stuff isn't really, it doesn't really accumulate. You just get a little bit of stuff from your present life circumstances. And so you don't have much stuff to deal with. And I certainly think that between these cycles of insight, that Bill Hamilton's idea is that if you have more stuff, then your dark night is going to be harsher during that time. I think that, psychedelics and some other things are really useful for going after your stuff, especially your past life stuff. A lot of scary stuff comes up, but then if you can deal with it, then you don't have so much to deal with, especially if you're like aware or mindful of creating more karma, and you do things in your life to avoid creating karma. Then you don't have that much that builds up. And then you don't get into situations like he got into, I don't think. Anyhow, then if you had more stuff, then you were likely to stay at that level longer and have a harder time during the dark night. This is hardly good science, but I guess it is a good enough working model until we have something better. That said, it does play to the issues model of awakening, which has the problems I mentioned already. The other explicit Dharma point here is that some people can get some paths very rapidly and easily, some rapidly and with difficulty, some slowly but without much difficulty, and some slowly with a lot of difficulty. Anyway, I was starting to regain my abilities to attain the formless realms, and was starting to experiment with rising through the jhanas with a light gnonic flavor, and coming out of 8th and getting a fruition. And then on November 20th, 1996, while brushing my teeth, I attained what I thought of at the time, and still do in most ways, as third path. Suddenly, everything was very different. Before that moment, I had thought of fruition as being nirvana, and reality being something you examine to get a fruition. Now everything seemed to be it. Everything was at once ultimate reality and relative reality. Form was just form, and that form was empty. This was a real transformation of perspective and paradigm, a whole different way of perceiving things. In many ways, that shift was as big a deal as stream entry. The November 20th fruition changed my world. After that, realization was about waking life in a way that it simply hadn't been before, except for a few brief phases. The sense of the center point, doer, controller, subject, had been seriously damaged and at times seemed basically gone. I also began to suddenly get what was meant by terms like luminosity in a way that was completely different from before. While brief phases in equanimity and in the sixth jhana had given transient glimpses of this, now it was much more obvious in most objects. As the weeks and months went on, this seemed to pervade experience more and more. It was a very different way of relating to ordinary sensate reality, a much more direct way, a way that had a vastly increased appreciation for the light in things, the localized nature of awareness that was intrinsic to sensations where they were. The implications of this would take about 6 years to really sink in, but it was a major shift of great importance. Just to interject on that luminosity idea, in physics, luminosity is kind of like your it's energy over time. Really, that is comes from a star, for example. And so in the reciprocal system of Dewey B. Larson, which I've done 580 some videos on here on this channel, Larson's system is the universe is made out of motion, not matter, not energy, but motion. Matter and energy are merely kinds of motion, and motion is the relationship between space and time. And so all of our scientific phenomena are kinds of motion, and they can be defined in terms of space and time. So instead of using the MKS system of units, they use just time and space. And in Larson's system, energy is time over space. Now, time and space can be in multiple dimensions, so that's what gives rise to all those permutations of different units. But energy is just simply time over space, just the same way that speed is space over time. But so energy is time over space, and so luminosity, being energy over time, is simply 1 over space. So that was the name of the section there, luminosity, 1 over space. But he just said that after attaining third path, or what he considered attaining third path, the concept of luminosity seemed much more meaningful to him. But now we're in a section that's called Nirodha Samapatti. Inspired by the canonical and commercial texts and by Bill Hamilton and Bhante Gunaratana, speaking a lot, surprisingly, about Nirodha Samapatti, I started trying for it. Remember how on my retreat where I reached stream entry, I had just inclined to jhanas and all 8 of them showed up in order? That ability had faded rapidly off retreat, so now it was time to relearn it. But now I wasn't on retreat, and my concentration wasn't as strong since I didn't have as much time to practice as on retreat. The trick was how to get back into them. Attending to form is very compelling and habitual, so switching to formlessness is a trick that is not always easy to master. My strategy involved giving in at times to the shamatha side of things, the smooth, flowing, present but less vibrational side of things to build up the first 4 jhanas well. As someone post-stream entry, I naturally cycled up through the first 4 vipassana jhanas when I sat down, typically taking around 15 to 40 minutes. So it was largely just a question of inclining the mind as much as I could to smoothness and to anything pleasant that pull onward to the 4th jhana occurred. Thus, by that sort of lateral inclination, I could transform what would ordinarily be a shift through the stages of insight into a drift up the first 4 jhanas, albeit still colored a bit by some fluxing and vipassana. Then I would resolve to attain the formless realms, try to remember what it was like back on retreat, try to incline the mind that way, and let that go and stay gently present and see where things would take me. This following formula worked well for many similar Dharma puzzles, and I highly recommend it. 1. Building a good foundation. 2. Formal resolution. 3. Remembering. 4. Inclining. 5. Repeating despite initial and subsequent failures. And 6. Studying and priming. I reread what Dharma books I had that covered the territory. I was interested in to further reinforce achieving my goal. It took many tries over many sits, but after some weeks of failing again and again, I could finally reattain the formless realms in daily life as I had while on retreat. As a normalizing aside, attaining true formless realms consistently, where the body is absolutely gone in daily life, is something that I have had to relearn again and again over the years, and have accomplished it by the same methods I used back then. At least for me, it is a skill set that I can get to with diligent work, but will generally lose again if I don't practice it often, as is true in general for most people regarding many of the higher concentration attainments. It is often thought that the Mahasi Sayadaw schools of meditation don't teach shamatha jhanas, but this isn't true. They just don't teach it initially, and by initially, I mean to people who haven't typically attained to at least the first 2 paths. In back rooms and behind closed doors, you will find Mahasi monastics and talented lay practitioners teaching and practicing the shamatha jhanas and formless realms, as well as occasionally things like the powers, but they just don't talk about these much. They consider establishing a firm foundation in insight too important, and they greatly favor the insight-first approach before giving emphasis to the shamatha jhanas. It just so happens that their standards for what a firm foundation in insight is includes at least 2 paths, if not 3. Anyway, back to the quest. After those frustrating but initially fruitful weeks of remastering the formless realms, I could lie down or sit and consistently rise through the 8 jhanas in about 30 to 40 minutes. So it wasn't that much of a stretch to follow the standard instructions and rise through them with just a bit of vibrational aspect to them also, and incline to Nirodha Samapatti and see what happened. It was only a few weeks later in mid-December, while sitting on the floor of a supply closet before work at the CDC's National AIDS Hotline, that I first attained Nirodha Samapatti. Very briefly, about 40 minutes into my usual 1-hour sit. I'm not sure how long it lasted, but it couldn't have been that long. It is hard to remember now, 2 decades later, exactly how many times after regaining the formless realms I had tried for Nirodha Samapatti and failed before finally attaining it, but my rough guess is 30 to 50 consecutive tries, meaning 30 to 50 one-hour sits. In short, should you find yourself in a similar situation practice-wise with similar aspirations, don't give up easily. The afterglow was so stunning that I was nearly unable to work normally, as the calm that pervaded was so totally chill that I would have these long pauses of silence during calls that day, though somehow none of the callers made any comments or seemed to notice. It was hard for me, being in my mid-20s and not as psychologically or emotionally advanced as I was meditationally, not to be impressed with myself and, in fact, to be quite arrogant about what I had managed to accomplish. I would like to think that stating these things are a problem would save someone else from the same fate, but I doubt that anything but your own personal experience and time can do that, as these are very heady attainments. It was sometime in early 1997 that I bought a Mac and started writing, as I felt I had a lot to say, and some of those writings would morph into this book. All right, that is the end of that chapter. We're going to move on to chapter 55, called Map Failure. I also had a problem, and that problem was that the Theravada path maps suddenly didn't seem so perfect to me anymore. Here I was, having gone through 3 very distinct, world-changing paths. Much of the transient sense field presented as luminous, largely happening on its own, and intrinsically aware of or just simply manifesting where things were. That majority of the sense field seemed to be expanding by the week, as the sense of luminosity and decentralized attention seemed to be permeating my whole perceptual space. This was clearly something beyond stream entry, very different from Second Path, and very different from anything Bill or Kenneth seemed to have any idea about, as far as I could tell, which added to the confusion. I could reproducibly get Nirodha Samapatti with the right setup, right entrance, right exit, and with the right massive, long-lasting, deep afterglow, and it sure did stand out from everything else. It seemed I had some unusual ability to easily and naturally surf exotic sub-flavors of many fascinating mind states and ways of perceiving phenomena as I recombined and mixed jnanas and jhanas with various emphases just by gently inclining attention, intending, and mentally stating the state and sub-aspects I wished to experience. I found I could just think the numbers and off the mind would go to that state or stage. I also felt I understood deep Dharma that was simply far beyond where I had been only a little over a year before, and could clearly see it manifest while walking around. And yet there was the huge issue of the fact that there were still the defilements. You see, as stated earlier, the standard maps have stream entry eliminating the first three defilements: personality belief, skeptical doubt, and attachment to rites and rituals. Check. I clearly had mastery of the stages of insight. Check. I could get repeat fruitions through all 3 doors. Check. I cycled naturally. Check. Then second path is supposed to attenuate greed, hatred, and delusion. Check. Then third path, which is called a non-return or anagami, is supposed to eliminate all greed, hatred, and delusion not bound up in the last 5 defilements. So second path attenuates greed, hatred, and delusion. Third path eliminates all greed, hatred, and delusion not bound up in the last 5 defilements that are eliminated at fourth path, which is called arhantship, namely attachment to the formed jhanas, attachment to the formless jhanas, or the formless realms, conceit, which he considers to be something subtler than just arrogance, and really meaning the perceptual sense that there is an I in any phenomenon. Restlessness and worry. Okay, so those are the 5 defilements that you eliminate at the fourth path. Restlessness, worry, attachment to formless realms, attachment to jhana, the form jhanas, and conceit. And the last veil of unknowing. Let me make this clear. I relate to Buddhist practice as I would relate to any other educational system that produces achievable results. Specifically, Buddhist practices contain many time-tested and effective exercises that are designed to produce specific results. Just as I might say something like, I got a BA in English literature from UNC Chapel Hill in 1991, just so I might say, on January 13th, 1996, I got stream entry after doing meditation retreats with practices designed to produce stream entry. I think similarly with respect to the remaining paths, jhanas, and other attainments, as we might proceed from getting a BA to a master's to a PhD and postdoc fellowships, as well as further career development. Thus, I think nothing strange about answering a patient's question about it, about when I graduated from medical school and how long I have been a doctor, just as I don't think of it as odd to have done Buddhist practices that lead to specific effects and had them work. However, the problem at that time was, by no means could I possibly say that all greed, hatred, and delusion not related to the last 5 of the 10 defilements were eliminated in me. The theory says that anagamis feel no lust, but I certainly felt lust. The perception of that lust was very different, but the physiological fact of the lust was still there. The tradition contained ideals that an anagami would be extremely calm at nearly all times, that they would not be able to do activities like work for a living, and so on. They say that anagamis are unable to become angry, but I could. Adrenaline still did what adrenaline does. Cortisol still did what cortisol does. Sympathetic tone ramped up in stressful situations. I still had plenty of worldly likes and dislikes, attractions and aversions in the ordinary sense. No check there. Houston, we have a problem. The maps that had worked with such remarkable precision began to break down, at least in my practice. I was suddenly in territory that I didn't find directly described anywhere, or exactly in the way I was experiencing it. And so it was during this period that I started delving into the maps even more than I had before. So my initial diagnosis or hypothesis is, again, that Dr. Ingram is not red-pilled, and he's not recognizing that Western society is hyper lusty and hyper adrenalized. And when these people were coming up with these standards 2,500 years ago or whatever, they probably didn't, think that you could access, lust just, at the press of a button, and that you could, all the adrenaline of, driving around in traffic or whatever, they didn't think about all those things never occurred to them. And so I think that's possible. I'm giving him credit. I'm thinking maybe he actually has become an onagami and has passed third path, but he just doesn't check these more advanced boxes. But on the other hand, maybe he hasn't achieved these things, and that these standards are valid. It's just a hypothesis. Okay, moving on. I started reading more books, pouring through them to get a sense of where I was. The staggeringly obvious answer right there in all its profundity still partially eluded me. Bhavana Society had an English translation of the whole Pali Canon, and if there was something related to the maps in it, I read it. I cruised used bookstores and found various texts such as the Dharma Pass by Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche, which had a pretty good map of the early stages, and then it suddenly got vague, as did the maps of the higher pass in the Pali Canon. I mean, this is kind of like, you have a map to maps to get to the top of Mount Everest, but once you get past 28,000 feet, there are not really that many people that have been up there. So the maps are going to be more vague by the time you get to that level. There was strangely little written about something that, from my vantage point, appeared more and more complicated. You see, there were all these new layers, all these subtle experiences to investigate that weren't clearly revealed or documented by others. Subtle background processes related to effort, to expectation, to wonder, to frustration, to questioning, to anxiety, to peace, to mapping, and other very core aspects about the sense of the center point, controller, and observer. There were layers and layers and layers. I found that the middle pass made for mighty, murky mapping. I was cycling again and again, and sometime in early 1997, perhaps March or April, it seemed I went through yet another full path cycle, and yet this was the first time that I completed what felt like a whole new path, and the whole world and the way my brain worked didn't change that much. It was a bit different in subtle ways, but the problem was that now that had been four path cycles, 4 clear path cycles, and yet to call myself an arahant would seem preposterous from all other points of view. Okay, we're going to stop right there. We'll take over tomorrow and see what happens. Thanks for tuning in today.